Hey fellow Linuxers, Xero here, aka Xero, and in this video I will be showing off my very first Linux distro. This is XeroLinux, an Arch-based distro with KDE Plasma. Before I go through the installation, let me get a few points out of the way. This is not a full-on distro by any stretch, nor is it an ArcoLinux Spinoff. It's just ArchLinux with Vanilla KDE, with a few visual tweaks here and there to isolate it from the look of WinBlows. And it's based on a cool what if by my good friend and Linux mentor Eric Dubois called ALCI, or simply put, ArchLinux Calamares installer, nothing more. Also, XeroLinux is unlike any other distro. It doesn't mess with system files, simply because, in my honest opinion, doing so could introduce many points of failure. It could break at any point during update. I prefer to leave the choice entirely up to the user. That being said, this distro was created primarily for myself, but I thought, why not share? Anywho, time to give credit where credit's due. XeroLinux wouldn't have been made possible without the wealth of information provided by the team over at ArcoLinux community. These guys rock. Building a custom ArchLinux distro is all about choices, right? My choices might not agree with yours, or everyone's. It's fine. Each individual uses different apps and has a different configuration than others. So I had to make my choices. I just wish I could satisfy everyone. Well, we all know that this ain't possible. So I hope choices I made are good enough. Finally, and this intro has dragged on long enough, I would like to end it by saying this has been quite an exercise for me, truly. Just be wary that I have only been using Linux for 8 months, so I'm kinda ill-equipped to handle any troubleshooting others can with many years of experience. For that, I do apologize. Anyway, more info about all that is available on the website. If I keep talking about all that, it's gonna make that video drag on for hours. Now that we have established that this distro was made for myself primarily, exercising my knowledge thus far, and that minimal support is available as I continue to endeavor to learn more as I go, let's get on with the installation, shall we? Okay, when you first boot XeroLinux on a UEFI machine, you will be welcomed with this screen. Just hit enter over here and wait for it to boot. Okay, booting. Once booted, you'll be welcomed by the XeroLinux installer. Before we go ahead with the installer, mention in the image here, feel free to minimize installer and explore distro before deciding to install. Let's do that. Check out all the choices I have made that I mentioned before. Browse around, see what I have. What you see is what you'll get in the end, if you don't select any packages in the Calamares installer that we're going to go through in a bit. That said, if you like the distro, just maximize the installer. Let's click next after the welcome screen. First page of the package list. Just keep in mind that an internet connection is a must to install XeroLinux. This package list is dynamic, so it will be constantly changing, meaning that if you install it today and I decide to change things, like add, remove some packages, and you want to install it later on a different machine, you'll be presented with a different list. Much the same, but with a few things moved around or removed. I did it that way so I don't have to recompile and re-upload the ISO, since unfortunately I'm on capped internet. Anyway, with that out of the way, as you have noticed that the stock Arch kernel is pre-selected for. That's because, as my good friend Eric says, everything on the ISO is frozen in time. Meaning what exactly? Well, meaning that if you downloaded my distro today and you kept it around for a few months and then decided to install it, if I hadn't checked this for you, you would end up installing a few months old version of the kernel. To avoid any incompatibilities later on, it's pre-checked. Below that is the processor U-code, meaning the processor driver. Make sure to select the right one for your processor, otherwise you're in a world of trouble. I am using AMD, so I will check AMD. As for the kernels, I gave you the choice of 4 different ones. The LTS one, long-term support, meaning that it's the most stable kernel out there. Other than that, I present you with a Zen Patch kernel. I've been told by many different Linux users around that this is one of the best kernels for compatibility, so I added it as a choice. The last two kernels are AMD specific. The first one is for Ryzen-based CPUs, Ryzen 1, 2, or 3. And the last one being for Raven Ridge APUs, meaning you guys out there who are running the 2000 series Raven APUs with built-in Vega graphics. If you use one of those, then go ahead, test that kernel out. Then we get to the difficult part, the GPU driver. I know what I have, and this distro was built primarily for myself, so I know what to select. But since I'm sharing online, I opted to add a wider variety of GPU drivers. Maybe one of them will suit your specific hardware. Keep in mind, I'm ill-equipped to give you any support, so do your research before going ahead, or test it out on a spare SSD if you wish, until you find the right combination for you. Let's go next. Here is where I present a vast array of applications you can select to install. And like I said in the beginning, everything will be pulled from the internet. Nothing is on the ISO itself. You got a variety of audio software, accessories, developer tools, browsers. I even included a choice to install VirtualBox during installation, and Wine, which will give you support for Windows applications. After that, the gaming section, where you can select to install Steam, Lutris, Minecraft Launcher, Play on Linux. As for games, if you opt to select games during installation, it will take a while, because those are full-fledged freeware Linux native games. So it depends on your connection. The slower the connection, the longer it will take to install. As for the extras, I didn't add too many. I didn't want to bloat the system once it was installed, but I added the most useful tools coming from ArcoLinux repositories, which I included on the ISO, and a couple of themes, basically Numix and Arc. Once that's done, we go through the installation the usual way. You select the language. For me, it's English, US. Next. Erase drive. Since we have only one hard drive, swap. Encrypt, not encrypt. If you opt to encrypt your drive, the installation will take a little bit longer. User creation time, and to keep it short, I'm gonna create generic. 00 home, the infamous password to auto login. Hit next, and I'll see you once the installation is done. Okay, install is done. But before we reboot, I'm just gonna let you know that there's something cool that awaits. Now we reboot. Cool, right? Yeah, that grub theme was made by myself. There's a ton more where that came from. They're all on my Git, actually. Link in the description. Now, before we boot into the system, I want to point out something. You notice how it says simply XeroLinux. Nothing more, nothing less. Usually, a lot of Arch-based distros out there that use grub, once you install it, you end up with something like along the lines of XeroLinux Linux with Linux. That's too many mentions of Linux if you ask me. Thanks to the guys over at EndeavourOS, I was able to get around that. Now it simply says XeroLinux. Or if you check out the advanced option, XeroLinux on Linux. None of that triple, quadruple Linux mentioned. Cool dudes over there. I highly encourage you to test out their distro. Anyway, let's head on to the system. There are a few things that you need to do once the install is done and you're logged into your system. I'll show that off once it's booted. Alright, welcome to your new system. First things first, there are things to do post-install. And here I'll show you what to do. Number one, I added an alias in terminal that needs to be run on first logon to fix a small bug in grub. Just run grubfix command in the terminal, then reboot. So since I included yaquake, just hit F12 and type grub fix. That's an alias. Hit enter, then type your password, then enter again. Before we reboot, I added another alias, should you need it, for Samba. If you have multiple computers on the same network and you share files between computers, be it Windows, other Linux computers. So to do that, you just type SMB, hit enter, and once it prompts you for a username, make sure it's the same user of the system. And now it's going to prompt us for the username. Since the user here is Xero, type Xero, enter, and now the password. Confirm, hit enter, and now it's gonna go through the rest of the motions. And now we reboot. And for that, there's an alias that the peeps over at ArcoLinux created. It's simply SR, sudo reboot. It will reboot, and I'll see you once it's done. Okay, welcome back to your system. Once all that has been done, you're free to start using and configuring the distro to your liking. Before I go, I just want you to know that all that information and more is available on the website, link in the description. And that's about it. I hope you enjoy my first ever distro. It'll keep on evolving with time, of course. With that, all that's left is to bid you farewell, and I'll see you in the next video. Don't forget to rate, comment, and subscribe.